The natal conjunction of the Moon and Mars represents one of the most high-velocity, emotionally combustible, and viscerally high-friction configurations a human nervous system can accommodate. In the archetypal tapestry of astrology, the Moon is the liquid, porous inner sanctuary of the psyche, governing the limbic system, the somatic memory banks, the instinctual attachment blueprints, and the absolute human necessity for emotional containment, safety, and rest. Mars, by stark and unyielding contrast, is the sharp, penetrating blade of individual ego will, the cosmic engine of aggression, severing, kinetic assertion, sexual heat, and survivalist competition. When these two fundamentally antithetical planetary principles fuse in a localized conjunction, the individual's emotional core is permanently set ablaze. The native does not experience their feelings as passing psychological weather, nor as the slow, chilled blocks of a Saturnian defense system. Instead, they experience their internal world as a series of immediate, high-temperature thermal eruptions. It is the archetype of the mother-turned-soldier, the raw nervous system functioning under a permanent state of siege, and the grueling lifelong mandate to transform a chaotic, self-destructive emotional hyper-reactivity into an unshakable, laser-focused discipline of conscious spiritual warriorhood. To comprehend the volatile internal mechanics of the Moon-Mars conjunction is to examine a psychic apparatus that operates with a hyper-accelerated fear and rage response, entirely starved of the capacity for natural relaxation. For the native, the subjective experience of living inside their own skin is akin to existing with an exposed, highly raw nerve that is constantly being sparked by the external environment. The Moon-Mars conjunction individual possesses an exceptionally sensitive, combative instinctual radar that automatically decodes neutral stimuli, casual remarks, or minor relational boundaries from others as direct, hostile acts of provocation or imminent threats to their personal autonomy. Because their internal boundaries are inherently porous yet fiercely guarded by the immediate proximity of Mars, they live in a state of chronic defensive anticipation. They operate under the unconscious conviction that to be vulnerable, to be soft, or to pause and digest an experience is to risk being instantly dominated, overwhelmed, or crushed by the aggressive wills of others. Consequently, the conscious mind remains trapped in a state of permanent mobilization, weaponizing its raw feelings into immediate, defensive counter-offensives before the environment has even fully registered a threat. This permanent internal combat breeds a highly problematic, repetitive behavioral mechanism known as the trauma loop of immediate emotional combustion. In their interpersonal relationships and daily lives, Moon-Mars conjunction individuals are intensely prone to extreme, short-fused, and volcanic eruptions of temper and impatience. They do not know how to hold an emotion, let it sit in the somatic matrix, or allow it to mature into cognitive clarity. Instead, the transmission from an external trigger to a visceral, muscular, and vocal outburst occurs in a fraction of a second. This hyper-reactivity frequently creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict. The native rushes into environments with their shields raised and weapons hot, projecting a fierce, abrasive, and hyper-defensive aura that naturally provokes irritation, defensiveness, or outright hostility from the people around them. When the environment inevitably pushes back against this aggression, the native views the confrontation as absolute proof that the world is an inherently combative, unsafe battlefield, completely blind to the reality that their own unconscious projection fired the opening shot of the war. The roots of this profound psychological friction are invariably traced back to an early childhood environment defined by intense localized chaos, hyper-competition, or a pervasive threat of domestic aggression. The child hosting this conjunction was typically raised in an atmosphere where their basic lunar needs for warmth, quiet containment, and unconditional safety were routinely invaded or violently disrupted by Martian dynamics. The home may have been a literal battleground of screaming matches, throwing objects, or sudden, volatile outbursts of parental temper. Alternatively, the child may have been forced to survive in a highly stressful, hyper-competitive family matrix where love and basic survival resources were conditional upon being the strongest, the fastest, or the loudest. The native internalized the devastating lesson that their vulnerability was a liability that would actively invite harm, learning very early that to protect their fragile inner child, they had to merge their maternal attachment needs with the armor of the warrior. They were starved of authentic, peaceful holding, forced to grow an aggressive, hyper-vigilant ego structure long before their emotional core was strong enough to regulate its own temperature. Energetically and physically, hosting this burning, high-velocity friction places an immense, exhausting strain on the individual's physical vehicle. The moon rules the stomach, the mucous membranes, the digestive secretions, the fluid balance, and the parasympathetic nervous system, while Mars rules the red blood cells, the muscular tissues, acute inflammation, bile, and the sympathetic fight-or-flight response. When these two forces fuse in a conjunction, the body becomes a literal furnace of unexpressed heat and kinetic tension. These individuals live with an extreme degree of muscular armoring, unconsciously clenching their jaws, their shoulders, and their abdominal walls to steel themselves against the next perceived strike. This constant state of physiological emergency manifests over time as chronic, acute digestive tract inflammation, hyperacidity, stomach ulcers, severe tension headaches, and sudden, high-burning fevers. The body is highly prone to injuries, cuts, burns, and inflammatory flares that match the internal emotional burns of the mind, as the physical tissue accurately materializes the intense, localized war raging between the impulse to protect and the impulse to attack. Yet, the ultimate evolutionary architecture of the Moon-Mars conjunction is not designed to permanently exhaust, traumatize, or condemn the native to a lifetime of bridge-burning rage. It is the elite training ground for the supreme spiritual warrior. The universe deliberately starves these individuals of a peaceful, easy childhood and smooth emotional path so that they are forced to dismantle their raw, animal reactivity and discover the absolute occult secret of conscious, deliberate power. The cosmos subjects them to endless provocations, high-stakes conflicts, and self-inflicted interpersonal disasters not to destroy them, but to burn away every single drop of their emotional entitlement, undisciplined impulsivity, and infantile defensiveness. They are being systematically re-engineered to realize that true strength is not the loud, sloppy, and chaotic explosion of a reactive ego, but the absolute containment, mastery, and strategic deployment of emotional passion. The supreme liberation for this placement requires a radical, terrifying act of somatic and psychological surrender. The native must learn the supreme courage of sitting entirely still within their own heat. The agonizing, repeating cycle of immediate combustion, burned bridges, and physical exhaustion will never cease until the individual undergoes a profound shift in consciousness, realizing that the aggressive, provoking monster they are fighting so viciously in the outside world is actually the unchanneled, wild current of their own vital energy attempting to break through their rigid defensive armor. They must learn to tolerate the immense vulnerability of delaying their reactions, allowing a provocation to enter their field, feeling the volcanic surge of adrenaline and hot rage coat their internal organs, and choosing to hold it completely contained within the body without projecting it outward or acting it out. They must undergo a total death of the defensive ego, willingly letting their immediate weapons drop, embracing the raw discomfort of their underlying fear and vulnerability, and learning to anchor their immense vitality within a core of disciplined, unshakable self-containment. When a Moon-Mars conjunction native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a hyper-reactive, self-sabotaging survivalist into a sovereign master of concentrated willpower, a magnificent transfiguration occurs. The heavy, abrasive armor dissolves, leaving behind an invincible, magnetic column of pure courage and protective authority. They emerge into the world entirely immune to the emotional manipulations, provocations, and intimidation tactics of lesser wills. Because they have sat in the absolute hottest furnaces of internal frustration, mastered the terrifying architecture of their own primal rage, and trained their nervous system to remain completely calm under intense pressure, they possess an unmatched, terrifying stamina. They become the ultimate crisis anchors, legendary emergency leaders, fearless defenders of the vulnerable, and master strategists, individuals who can walk completely unafraid into the most volatile, violent, and chaotic environments on Earth, hold the absolute weight of an emergency on their shoulders with an unblinking, majestic composure, and execute monumental realities because their intent was forged in the absolute mastery of their own emotional fire. To penetrate the absolute lowest, atomic bedrock of the Moon conjunction Mars alignment is to expose a psychological landscape running a continuous simulation of immediate physical ambush. While the visible manifestation of this configuration often presents as an intimidating capacity for rapid execution, an uncanny ability to mobilize massive amounts of raw energy during a crisis, and a fiercely magnetic, pioneering presence, a clinical descent into its core reveals a darker, more exhausting reality. The native operates under a permanent subconscious directive that treats all emotional vulnerability as an invitation to immediate assault. The Moon is the instinctual self that seeks to relax, soften, and yield to the comforting currents of connection. Mars is the absolute, unyielding law of the blade that demands constant separation, defense, and localized supremacy. The conjunction locks these two into an intractable, high-frequency vice grip, forcing the native to spend decades living with a nervous system that decodes a partner's normal emotional withdrawal or an unexpected boundary not as a routine life event, but as a direct, incoming kinetic strike. The most profound, insidious pathology of this configuration is a phenomenon that can be defined as the hyperfixation on the hostile undercurrent. Because the natives' early environment taught them that safety is an illusion, and that peace is merely the quiet interval between violent disruptions, they develop an absolute intolerance for authentic stillness. A Moon conjunction Mars individual cannot simply rest in a harmonious environment, enjoy a casual conversation, or surrender to the soft, predictable rhythm of a quiet life. Their mind is a permanent tactical command center, obsessively auditing every room for entry points, exit strategies, and potential aggressors. If an environment is genuinely peaceful and devoid of friction, the native experiences an acute, terrifying disorientation. The lack of tension feels to them like an atmospheric trap, triggering an intense surge of survival anxiety. To relieve this internal pressure, they will instinctively deploy calculated, subconscious provocations, manifesting as sharp retorts, unnecessary debates, or sudden, aggressive boundary testing, designed to force the other person to push back or push against them. They must intentionally fracture the peace to feel a solid, resistance-backed sense of reality, fully convinced that they only know who they are when they are actively fighting something. This permanent internal mobilization breeds a highly problematic behavioral mechanism known as the psychic preemptive strike. Because these individuals carry a cellular memory of absolute vulnerability resulting in pain or humiliation, they live in a state of chronic offensive anticipation. If they sense that a partner is pulling away, or if they perceive that a professional ally is attempting to restrict their autonomy, the Moon-Mars current instantly shifts their nervous system from an attachment footing to a scorched earth posture. Rather than communicating their tender underlying fear, or expressing their exhaustion, which their hyper-masculine ego structure views as an act of absolute, humiliating cowardice, they launch devastatingly abrasive, sharp, and completely disproportionate emotional counter-assaults. They will unearth a partner's deepest, most sensitive raw spots and slice into them with surgical, Martian precision to utterly neutralize the perceived threat. This tactical ruthlessness routinely creates the exact catastrophe they dread. They inadvertently traumatize their loved ones, alienate their allies, and burn down the very foundations of emotional safety they spend their life trying to build. Furthermore, this aspect creates an exceptionally dangerous, almost addictive relationship with the archetype of the emotional sparring partner. The Moon-Mars native possesses an absolute, deep-seated contempt for anything that feels soft, comfortable, or inherently easy in the emotional realm. They suffer from an ambient guilt whenever life is fluid, viewing emotional ease as a dangerous anesthesia that leaves them vulnerable to ambush. To cure this anxiety, they are repeatedly drawn to highly volatile, combative, or pathologically defensive partners. They seek out individuals who embody the sharp, unyielding power of Mars, individuals who will fight them, challenge them, or force them to deploy every ounce of their psychic stamina just to maintain their sovereignty. To the twisted, survivalist calculus of this conjunction, feeling the absolute heat of a screaming match, enduring the grueling torment of relational warfare, and surviving a brutal, high-friction interpersonal cycle is the only authentic state of connection, leading them to view a peaceful, stable, and healthy partnership not as a sanctuary, but as an uninspiring, dead-end pasture. On a genetic and karmic level, This conjunction indicates that the individual has been appointed as the absolute executioner of a bloodline's unvetted rage, domestic violence, and survivalist trauma. They inherit a cellular matrix choked by generations of ancestors who survived through the severe, aggressive suppression of others, or who were utterly crushed under the boot of localized tyranny, hidden abuse, or profound societal combat. The native does not just carry personal stress, they carry the compacted, radioactive trauma weight of 100 dead soldiers and mothers who lived with their fists clenched in the dark. Their psychic atmosphere feels heavy and serious because they are the designated circuit breaker who must choose either to consciously face, contain, and alchemize this volatile ancestral inheritance, or let it repeat its destructive cycle by physically and psychologically fracturing their own children, partners, and lives. The ultimate evolutionary liberation for the Moon conjunction Mars native requires a radical, terrifying act of somatic capitulation. They must learn the supreme courage of allowing their emotional weapons to be entirely dismantled without fighting back. The agonizing, repeating cycle of immediate combustion, burned bridges, and catastrophic destruction will never cease until the individual realizes that the aggressive, provoking monster they are fighting so viciously in the outside world is actually the projection of their own repressed, volatile power attempting to break them out of the suffocating tomb of their own defense mechanisms. They must undergo a total psychological death, willingly dropping their sharp, defensive tracking tactics, sitting completely exposed in the raw wreckage of their broken relationships, and discovering that when everything they thought kept them safe is stripped away, their core capacity to feel, survive, and regenerate remains completely untouchable. When a Moon conjunction Mars native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a hyper-reactive, self-sabotaging survivalist into a sovereign master of concentrated emotional force, a magnificent transfiguration occurs. The heavy, abrasive armor shell dissolves, leaving behind an unbreakable, magnetic pillar of pure worldly and psychological authority. Having sat in the absolute hottest furnaces of internal frustration, stared directly into the absolute bottom of the psychological abyss, and survived the total annihilation of their infantile attachments, they possess an unmatched, terrifying stamina. They become the ultimate crisis anchors, master strategists, and shamans of the modern world, individuals who can walk completely unafraid into the most chaotic, collapsing, and toxic environments on Earth, hold the entire weight of human suffering on their shoulders with an unblinking, majestic composure, and manifest monumental healing because their willpower was forged in the absolute zero of self-mastery. Subscribe, like, and share.